It seems as though almost every week as we come to the book of Job, we come to something that needs an introduction. We started with an introduction to Job, and then we started with an introduction to the counsel of God with the angelic beings, and then we introduced Job speaking, and then we introduced Job's friends speaking, and now we come to Job replying to his friends speaking. So we have, seems as though it's almost something new every week that we need to stop and consider for a moment before we press into the material. We are in the midst now of the round one of Job and his friends. I'm not sure how many rounds this is going to go, but it's the round one where Job's friends speak and then Job replies to them. After each of the speeches, Job will reply to his friend's question, and it's what we would say he's replying to an implied question that will appear in each of the speeches given by Job's friends. For Eliphaz, who spoke first, that question appears in chapter 5, verse 27, the very end of his speech. He says, "Behold, this we have searched out. It is true. Hear and know it for your good." We've searched it out. In other words, we know what's best for you. Do you not understand this? Okay, that's the implied question. Do you not get it? We're smart guys, okay? I mean, I've gotten this information straight from a spirit who has told me these things, okay? So you'll notice there's an implied question in there. Now, let me remind you that the friends of Job are going to come, and they have a basic thesis that they're going to bring to Job again and again and again in this first round. And it is this: Job, the reason that you are suffering is because of your moral failures. You are experiencing what you ought to have happen to you because you have sinned. The character of Job is being questioned here. Attacked, questioned, whatever word you want to use there. There's something happening to Job's character here. And his friends, you remember, are doing this under a horrible assumption. And the horrible assumption is this: well, look, the wicked always get what they deserve. And because you are suffering, dear Job, therefore you must be a reprobate man suffering for what you deserve. Now, that's an assumption. It's a horrible assumption. And I call it horrible because it's a word best describing the fact that it couldn't be more wrong. Okay? Wicked don't always get what they deserve, and the righteous don't always get what they deserve in this world, right? And so these men are saying to them, look, you're suffering because you have some hidden evil in your life, and to right the matter, you must go to God, confess whatever the sin is, and be restored. And we know this to be true because a spirit came and told us about it, you see. So Eliphaz's implied question to which Job is forced to reply now is, do you not see the evil within yourself that has brought the suffering upon you? I mean, listen to Eliphaz's words in 5:17. Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore despise not the discipline of the Almighty. You and I would read that as Christians as, well, that's what happens when God loves his children. But that's not what Eliphaz is saying. What Eliphaz is saying is, God disciplines those who are wicked. Despise it not, for it is designed to turn you away from your evil and back to the Lord. It's a subtle thing, but it's a massive thing if you don't get that quite correct. Now, let me just remind you of something here that you need to consider. Okay, we've talked about this before, but I'm going to put this before you frequently. None of these men, all right, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, Elihu, or Job, none of these men know the intention of this suffering from within that heavenly council. None of them know this. You and I do, because we're reading the book and we're privy to what happened behind the scenes, right? But these men don't know that. So what you have is a group of men who are all struggling to figure this out. They don't know that it's a part of God's purpose to show his decree. They don't understand that this idea that this is all taking place in order that God might say, what I have decreed is so and cannot be changed. They don't know that. So they're forced to wander around in the darkness. So the back and forth that we're going to see between Job and his friends is based on two things. It's based, number one, on the limited revelation of God, and secondly, the typical responses of human beings to the issues of suffering and death. What we have here is men floundering around because they don't have much in the way of revelation. Number one, they don't know the heavenly counsel, but even more than that, they don't know the whole counsel of God because they're living in a time frame when there is literally no revelation from God. I mean, this is before the days of Moses, and so nothing that you have in front of you in those 66 books has been written yet. They have nothing like that. And secondly, therefore, they're floundering around as men who do what men do. Well, how do we answer this in light of our own intelligence, right? How do we answer this in terms of our own understandings of the world? And you know how that goes, right? Does it ever lead to the right place? So this is the repartee that you're going to have between these men, which is what makes this so very interesting. Now, we're going to look then today at chapter 6 and 7, which is Job's reply to the first speech of the friends of Job, which we looked at last week. But these two chapters are extraordinarily difficult to outline, okay? And I'll suggest to you why. Job seems to talk to everybody, and he seems to talk to everybody all at the same time. He talks to himself, he talks to his friends, he talks to God. I think sometimes he even talks to the wind, if you will. It's almost as though he doesn't know who to talk to. It's almost as though it's like, I'm going to talk over them. In other words, it's a man who's floundering on going, I don't know what to say, in a sense. And if you've read this chapter without having actually read it, you might get the exact same impression, especially if you're like me and not familiar with poetry and how it works, right? You read through this and go, what in the world is this all about? So it is difficult to analyze. In fact, it took Calvin 7 sermons to get through this reply. Sermons 23 to 29. It took him a full week. Remember, he's preaching every day on this book. And so every day for 7 days, he preaches this for a week to analyze Job's reply. But I'm going to use just what we call the KISS principle, right? Keep it simple. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. The keep it simple principle says that it's probably the best way to look at this is, number one, Job simply first laments his friend's advice, and he adds a little more lamentation of his own life in the process. But he begins basically by lamenting what he's heard from his friends. Number two, he asserts his innocence. That is fairly clear in the middle section of this section. And then thirdly, he contemplates the mysteries of the human condition. He contemplates the existence. So 3 parts. He laments his friend's advice and his own life, because they're a part of it. Secondly, he asserts his innocence, and then thirdly, he sort of steps back and contemplates the meaning of life. Now, Calvin does note 2 things from this reply that are important, I think. Number one, our natural tendency is to fear that which touches our body far more than any fear of the judgment of God that comes upon the soul. Because we are material creatures, because we are physical beings, because we are creatures of the dust, our natural tendency is to fear that which would harm us physically far more than what we're concerned about what comes spiritually. All right? And secondly, our human strength against trials and tribulations is utterly sufficient to get through them. We do not possess the natural strength of spirit to make our way through these things. Thus, we need for God to sustain us, to preserve us. One of the central elements of the gospel of Jesus is the belief that God not only saves us, but preserves us to the end, because we could not hold on to that salvation if it were left in our capacity. Okay. So these 2 things, I think, as Calvin outlines them in his sermons, are critical for understanding what it is that Job is saying. Our natural tendency is to fear that which comes against our body much more than our soul. And secondly, we are creatures that are weak. spiritually. So this takes us then into Job's reply, Job chapter 6. And we'll start there. And again, I'm not going to read all of these verses and exegete them all. I'm just going to try to hit the highlights for you. In chapter 6, the chapter begins with verse 1. Job answered and said, "Oh, that my vexation were weighed and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are rained against me." Jump down to verse 8. "Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would fulfill my hope, that it would please God to crush me, and he would let loose his hand and cut me off. This would be my comfort. I would exult in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One." Now, it's a good place to start. Job, you read these verses and here's what you see. You see a man who's confused, deeply confused. In fact, the word vexation is used up here. He talks about his calamities and vexation in verse 2. In fact, I noticed just a minute ago when I was reading, Hannah had vexation when she didn't understand why she didn't have a child. This word vexation is the state of being annoyed or frustrated because you're unable to understand something to be true. That's to be vexed. I don't get it. I don't understand why I'm having to deal with this. But that's the point that he's starting. He's kind of going back to what he said in chapter 3. If only I could be spared of having to live this life and examine the realities of calamity. Oh, that God would just crush me out of existence. Wouldn't that just be better? Just stomp on me, Lord, and that'll just take care of it all. Well, that's not going to happen. Okay, that's the point. It's not going to happen, and Job knows it's not going to happen. So he has this sense of being annoyed or frustrated, and he's unable to understand fully. In verse 6, he says his life is tasteless, meaning it has no savor. It's just bland and unappetizing. It just doesn't have any meaning. There's nothing beyond this. And in verse 4, he knows that what is befalling him is from the Almighty. Okay, so he recognizes in the end that he's not really just experiencing random difficulties, but things that come from God by virtue of what he ordains to come to pass. But, all of that being true, he mistakenly assumes that he must find the strength to make it through. Look at verses 12 and 13. "Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Have I any help in me when resource is driven from me?" See, he turns to himself. He turns inward in this part and says, is it me? Do I have to find the strength? Now, let me remind you of what Calvin said about Job. All right? Job makes good points badly. Okay? Eliphaz makes bad points very well, and has, as we saw last week. He made excellent points, but they were wrong. He made them well, but they were wrong. Here, Job will actually make good points, but does so rather poorly. And here's an examination of his how he does this rather poorly. He recognizes that suffering is something that we cannot fully process and understand. Often, it's something we cannot fully process and understand. We look at the suffering in our lives and go, why? I don't know why. In fact, that's one of the questions we often ask. Why? Why am I having to experience this? Why am I having to deal with this reality, this loss, this pain, this trouble? Why? He cannot fully process it. But at the same time, he knows it is what God has ordained over him. So he has this contrast. See, this, we call it a paradox. On the one side, it's how come I'm suffering? I don't know why. And at the same time, I know that it's from God, therefore it must have a reason. So even though I don't know there's a reason, I do know there's a reason. I don't know what the reason is, but I do know there's a reason, and back and forth. And we do this all the time. And I bet if I asked you to raise your hand, if you've ever had a situation like this in your life, almost every one of you would put your hand up. Because this is life. Life is full of, I don't get it. I don't understand. I'm perplexed. I am, or as Job says, I am vexed. And he cannot seem to help but lament his life as being futile, even though at the same time he knows it comes from God. We've been tempted to that quite often, aren't we? Yeah. I know this life is futile. I know God is in control, but life is futile. Okay, see, Job is struggling with the realities of what it means to be a man with no revelation and a man who's unaware of what's taking place behind the scenes. So he goes where we would typically go. All right, so Job starts his reply to Eliphaz with a pity party. A pity party, you know what a pity party is, right? You've all thrown one. But even in the midst of his pity party, he does make a good point. This is why Calvin could say he makes good points rather poorly. In verse 10, he confesses that he has not denied the words of the Holy One. In the midst of the speech, he says, but I know that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. He's not gone so far as to deny the teachings of God that he has. Minuscule as they are, nonetheless he knows them. I would argue that he's a man living in a time that's inherent to him that he knows these things. Okay, but we'll get back to that in a minute. He knows inherently that there is something real and good in what he's experiencing. He may pity himself, but he does admit that there's more to the story than meets the eye. All right, that's where he starts. He may lament. He may pity himself. He may wish God would just crush him out of existence. But in the end, what he really knows is that there's probably a meaning here I haven't discovered yet. And so then he turns his attention to his friends in verse 14. He says in verses 14 to 17, he who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed. That word could better be translated as a wadi, W-A-D-I, a wadi. As torrential storms that pass by, which are dark with ice and where the snow hides itself. When they melt, they disappear. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. Skip down to verse 24. Teach me, and I will be silent. Make me understand how I've gone astray. How forceful are upright words. But what does reproof from you reprove? Do you think that you can reprove words when the speech of a despairing man is wind? You would even cast lots over the fatherless and bargain over your friend. All right, so what he's doing here is he turns from his lament and he looks at Eliphaz and he says something to him. He says, you know what you are like? You are like a friend who withholds kindness. All right, so what he's saying to Eliphaz is, that wasn't very helpful. Okay? That wasn't very helpful. In fact, he likens it to a wadi, what the ESV calls a torrent bed. In the desert, there are places where water naturally runs when it rains. It collects and runs through those places, right? They're called wadis. It's simply a trench or of some sort, or a creek bed of some sort, where when it rains, the rain runs through that place, but it doesn't last. It doesn't stay there. It just kind of runs through and then dries up again. If you ever lived in Arizona, you're driving in the highways in Arizona, and you drive over bridges, and it says something river, and you look over the bridge, you go, there's no water here, and it doesn't look like there's been water here for a long time. That's the point. It's a dry riverbed. It's a place where the rains come, and they rush through, and then they disappear. So if you're traveling in such a place, and you come across a wadi, you're going to be, more times than not, disappointed, because there's nothing there. It's a dry bed. That's what he is saying here when he says, my brothers are treacherous as a torrent bed. When they melt, verse 17, when they melt, they disappear. When it's hot, they vanish from their place. You think you are bringing me life-saving waters, but you're nothing more than a wadi where it just drifts away. It's not real. It doesn't last. Okay, that's what he is saying to them. It doesn't keep long-lasting help for the weary traveler, only the remnants of what was once there. Basically, what Job is saying is, Eliphaz, your advice only adds to my misery. Your advice only adds to my misery. It's like looking into the wadi for life-giving water only to see dryness and emptiness. And the reason why is because Job considers the advice of Eliphaz to miss the mark of his real need. Miss the mark of his real. What did Eliphaz think his real need was? You have sin in your life. Get it fixed. And Job says, no, you've missed the mark. He speaks of himself in verse 26 as a despairing man. And as a despairing man, his friends assumed that his words, verse 26, the speech of a despairing man, his words reveal something in need of reproof. He says, you're talking to me like I need to fix something when nothing needs to be fixed. That I am morally impure in some way from which I must repent. But what Job is arguing is they're wrong. For Job is convinced that he is not being punished. All right, we'll come back to proof of that in a moment. He's saying to them, listen, you give me this great advice, but it's advice that misses the mark. Right? It's like going to somebody who's having a difficulty over here in his life, and you offer advice on how to fix this over here. That doesn't make any sense. You're not being helpful. You're speaking a lot of words, and you look like an expert, but you're an expert in the wrong thing. My problem is not that I have sinned against the Lord. My problem is something else. But you're not helping. All you're doing is bringing your wind. In fact, in the very next chapter, when Bildad speaks in 8:2, Bildad will consider Job's reply here to be a great wind. Because he'll say exactly the same thing. You're just blowing smoke. Hey, here's the real issue. Okay? Here's the real issue. So Job laments the empty comfort of his friends, for their advice is shallow and unhelpful. Their advice is shallow and unhelpful. So this is a good point to stop and note something with you. Be careful who you surround yourself with or who you call a friend. Be careful. It is possible for well-meaning people to drag you away from the truth of Scriptures. Even people who might believe that they are Christians. Who we surround ourselves will have a great deal of effect upon how we think. And I suppose, in a way, if I'm going to rant, as I typically do, probably should also ask not only who are your friends in life, but who are your friends on social media. You know, those artificial two-dimensional friends that you have that don't really exist. None of them actually really exist. They're just two-dimensional creatures. They're two-dimensional images on a screen that have absolutely nothing to do with the person who supposedly posted it. You have to be very careful about who you surround yourself with. Because I have a sneaking suspicion that the vast majority of us are probably getting more advice from our friends and our Facebook pages than we are from the pages of Scripture. And that is extraordinarily dangerous. That's what Job is basically saying to his friend. He's saying, you're just flapping your gums. And it's not helping me. It's not useful advice. And it certainly isn't consistent with what I know to be true. Because what did he say? I know that I have not denied the words of God. So he's looking at Eliphaz and saying, you are trying to convince me of something that is not true. And it harkens to Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15, 33 and 34, when Paul says, do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. That's a quotation, by the way, from a secular source. But Paul considers it to be excellent advice, and so he includes it. Thus it becomes inspired Scripture, by the way. Yeah. Wake up from your drunken stupor, as is right, and do not go on sinning. For some have no knowledge of God. I say this to your shame. Paul gives that kind of forceful advice because he knows the reality of not everyone who comes and offers you advice is offering you advice consistent with what God preaches in His Word. Be careful of who your friends are. Be careful who you hang around with. Be careful who you are influenced by. Because they will probably have much more effect in your life than the Word of God. Remember, the devil can use even the most unsuspecting of souls to whisper lies into your ears. He is powerful. And he comes as an angel of light. And people think that just because they've heard something good, that it must be true. When in fact, it quite often is deadly. So, in the first 27 verses of chapter 6, Job starts his reply by lamenting his existence again and lamenting his friends and then turning to his friends and going, "You're not being helpful." Which leads me then to verses 28 to 30, which I think are probably the three most important verses in this entire reply. Here's what he says. He says, "But now be pleased to look at me, for I will not lie to your face. Please turn, let no injustice be done. Turn now. My vindication is at stake. Is there any injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern the cause of calamity?" All right, now listen to those words. Job here is asking the $64,000 question. He's asking the question of both his friends and of God. Now, let me just stop when he says, "Look at me." All right, who's he talking to? Who's he talking to? All right. Now, our natural inclination would say, well, he's looking at Eliphaz to make this statement, right? Because that's the guy who just spoke. And so he might literally turn and look at him, since it is Eliphaz that has accused him of being unright with God. Job clearly makes the statement to him by way of reply. Let me be clear to you, Eliphaz, in the face of your accusation. All right, so it's certainly obvious, I would think, that Job turns and looks at his friend. But it's also possible that Job is also speaking to God here. Okay, remember I said this chapter is difficult to outline because you're not sure who he's talking to. In this case, I think he might be talking to God as much as he's talking to Eliphaz, because he says, "Please turn, for I will not lie to your face." Certainly he's not going to turn, certainly he can say that to Eliphaz, but who would be much more impressed by such a statement? It's also directed towards God himself. I mean, by implication, the only one who can truly know if Job is innocent is God himself. Eliphaz can't know that. Eliphaz can assert that Job is guilty, but he can only assert it. He doesn't know it. That's the whole problem with much of this, is that nobody ever actually lists the sins of Job that need to be repented of. So it seems reasonable that Job would be talking to Eliphaz, but it also seems highly likely that Job is looking through Eliphaz at God and saying, "You know if there's any injustice on my tongue. You know if my palate can discern the cause of calamity." In other words, the "please turn" in verse 29 is a call for God to look at him and bring vindication, which Job claims is at stake, can only come from God. Only God is the one who can bring vindication. God is the only one that can turn vexation into vindication. Wasn't that clever? See? Only God can do that. And so I think these three verses are certainly being spoken to Eliphaz, but I think they're far more importantly being spoken to God. And let me suggest a third person that Job may be speaking to. Now again, we know this. Job may not have known it, but we know this. What if he's also speaking to the father of lies? What if he's also speaking to the devil? Is there any injustice on my tongue? It's almost as though he's looking at Satan and going, "I know who you really are. You're a liar. You've always been a liar. On my tongue, there's no injustice. There's no lies on my tongue, but there is on yours." See it? Has Job said anything that would change his state before God? Has Job said anything that would change his state before God? Has he in any way repudiated his relationship to God? Has he in any way said, "I don't want to have anything to do with God. I don't want to have anything to do"? No, in fact, quite the opposite. He's turning to God here and saying, "Hey, I'm looking to you for vindication." True, he laments his existence and he struggles to understand why. Who doesn't? He does not actually say anything sinfully untruthful. Again, as Calvin points out, he makes his good points, unfortunately, quite poorly. But he has not in any way spoken in such a way as to deny the God that he's trusting. He understands the importance of truth, which you could make a good assertion Satan does not. So in a sense, you could see this also being spoken to the devil. Now, again, Job probably doesn't know that, but you and I should see that. Because we know the whole picture. We know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. We know that the devil is probably behind the scenes of Eliphaz's speech. So it's almost as though we can see Job speaking not only to the Father and to Eliphaz, but also to the devil. So here's what he does. He asserts by way of rhetorical question that he has not said or done anything sinful. Verse 30, is there any injustice on my tongue? That's a rhetorical question. Notice he's not asking for an answer. He's asserting something. Do you see anything on my tongue in which I have spoken anything unjust? Have I spoken anything that's untrue? In fact, if you connect that back to his earlier statement, when he said in verse 10, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One, you put those two things together, you get the very real impression that Job is standing in front of Eliphaz and God and saying, I have kept the word, I have not lied, I have not said anything untrue, I don't see any sin in me that needs to be repented of so that your hand of punishment on me, O God, will be removed. I don't see anything like that. That's what he's saying. Cannot my palate discern the cause of calamity? Is there anything in my mouth that would be the cause of calamity, that you could discern to be the cause of my own calamity? In other words, have I said anything that has brought this suffering on me? Anything? And of course, we know the answer to that, right? The answer is no. That's the whole point of chapters 1 and 2 of this book. God has declared the man to be righteous. God has declared him to be blameless and upright. And he's purposed that to be the case. And so here we have Job trying to understand that in this world. There's no reason, Job says, to believe that anything in my mouth is the cause of my calamity. So his response to his friend is, you are wrong. In essence, you are wrong. You're claiming that it's my sin that's caused this suffering. I say to you, you are wrong. Which causes then us to come to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is probably the hardest chapter of the Bible I've ever read. But I don't think it's that hard when you step back from it and realize what Job is actually doing. Okay, here's what he says in verses 1 to 3. Has not man a hard service on earth, and are not his days like the days of a hired hand? Like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like a hired hand who looks for his wages. So I am allotted months of emptiness, and nights of misery are appointed to me. Down to verse 7. Remember that my life is a breath, my eye will never again see good. Here's what Job is doing. You step back and read this. And by the way, you got to read it like 30 times to get this, but you just read it again and again and again. It finally comes to you. Oh, Job is stepping back from the reality of his own life, and he is contemplating the reality of what you and I would call the human condition. What it means to be human. Or more specifically, what it means to be human in a fallen, sinful world. That's where he's going. He's contemplating the realities of the human condition. Now, Job first contemplates the realities of life speaking to himself in order that God would hear him. Okay, so in the first 10 verses, Job is sort of talking to himself. Or you could say he's talking to the wind. He's just throwing words out there to the wind. This is what we have. This is the world in which we live. It's in many ways like a man standing in front of a mirror giving a soliloquy about something going on in his life. Nobody's really listening to him other than himself. But at the same time, he's not really talking to himself. He's talking to the wind. He's just talking. I got to speak. I got to get these words out. I don't care who hears them. I'm just talking. All right, that's what he's doing really in the first 10 verses. And you'll notice there's a therefore in verse 11 that sort of clears that up. Okay. So what he says is this. Look, life is full of hard service. Life is full of hard service on earth. Job recognizes the unfortunate reality of human existence. And what is the unfortunate reality of the human existence? It's called the curse. It's called the curse. Hard service on earth. Kind of sounds like what God said Adam would experience, right? Up until now, your food has just come to you without you having to do anything. Now, you're going to have to go out there, and you're going to have to till the soil, and it's going to grow weeds, and the rain is going to come and then just run off because it's not going to stick around, and your life is going to be hard. And all of us know this to be true. Life is hard. Or as the proverb writer says, life is hard, and then you die. That's how it is. That's called the curse. Man has hard service on earth. Are not his days like the days of a hired hand? How many days of the hired hand? Short. A hired hand is, in this context, probably someone who would come and harvest your fields for you for a season, and then he's done. Like a wisp, gone, right? There for a few days and gone. When we were living in Kansas, we used to see these custom cutters that would come. And they would, 6, 7, 8 combines would show up in a field, and they would just mow the thing down in a day and then move on to the next place. They're like locusts, really. But they're here and they're gone. That's the picture that he's painting. It's hard service. A short life of difficulty and suffering for those born into it. He calls it months of emptiness, verse 3, nights of misery, verse 4. He says, my flesh is clothed with worms and dirt, verse 5. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. Okay, just like that, right? Short, life is short. Verse 7, my life is a breath. We live but a short time on the earth and are gone. Verse 9, like the cloud that fades and vanishes. This is the reality of human existence. We are here for a short time, we live, we die, and that's it. Look at the gravestone in the graveyard. It has a beginning date and an ending date, and your entire life is summed up by the dash in between. That's it. And most of the time, we die, we're buried, and we're forgotten. Life goes on. This is the human existence. This is the human experience. This is what we endure by virtue of the curse. Now, I would have you to note here that I don't think that this is Job complaining about the specific nature of his suffering. Okay, I know it looks like that. You look at verse 5 when he says, my flesh is clothed with worms and dirt, my skin hardens, it breaks out afresh. Well, that certainly looks like what he's experiencing at the moment as he's sitting there scraping himself with a piece of pottery because he has these pustules all over his body. It kind of looks like that. But I think that the larger picture is probably Job considering the totality of the existential nature of man living in a fallen world. Just as I said at the outset, what does Calvin point to as one of the important things to consider? The fact is that our natural tendency is to be much more afraid about what happens to us in our body than we are about what will happen to us and to our soul. Even as Jesus said, do not fear the one who can kill the body, be afraid of the one who can kill the soul. Because our natural tendency is to look at life as entirely physical. Right? We have a tendency to do that. Yeah. I know you're in here this morning and you're listening to me, and for this 0.5% of your life, you're concerned about spiritual matters. But my guess is when you hit those doors out there, and you get in your car, and you drive away, you spend the next 167 of those hours thinking about life, difficulties, troubles. Oh yeah, tomorrow I got to go back to work, or I got to do this, or I got to take care of that, right? We're so materialistically focused as human beings. I know I live in the same world you do. I understand these things. We are physical creatures. We're mortal. We're terrified of what could come against the body. We're terrified of these things. I mean, there's certain words in the English language that if someone says that to you, you shudder. Cancer. And when we hear that word, it's like, oh, my life just came to an end. No, it didn't. But that's our natural tendency, isn't it? We are terrified of what happens to us in our bodies. Thus, we have a tendency to ignore the spiritual reality of God's judgment. I mean, look, how easy is it going to be for the so-called experts to scare this population again? I mean, we're already doing it. We're already seeing it happen, right? COVID is coming back. Did you hear about this? Quickly, go get your face diaper, put it on. And people do. I mean, every single study and 3 years of evidence has demonstrated they don't work, and yet, what do people do? We are so easily scared. We are physical beings who are terrified of living life as humans because, well, we're so focused on the body. That's what Job is saying. The existential reality of what it means to be human is that we live in a fallen world. We are terrified of every little thing that comes along. Job contemplates the reality of human life. It is short, it is full of trouble. But this is only the introduction of his address to God. Notice verse 11. Therefore, I will now consider the greater truths that need to be addressed. Therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Here's what he's going to do. He's going to turn his attention from just speaking to the wind to speaking to God about this reality. So he says in where am I here? I got the wrong numbers here. 17. What is man that you make so much of him, and that you set your heart on him? Visit him every morning and test him every moment. How long will you not look away from me, nor leave me alone till I swallow my spit? If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me, but I shall not be. Here's what he's doing. He asks a question. If this is the lot of what it means to be human, why does God care? Okay? That's what he's asking. Why does God care? Or more specifically, why do you, God, care? Notice he turns the pronouns here to someone. Okay, that he's obviously speaking to someone. In the part that I just read to you, it's clear that he can only be speaking to God here. There's nobody else that can answer these kind of questions. What is man? You make so much of him. If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Okay, so he's clearly referring to the Creator in this question, and he's asking, why would God take any account of man, or more specifically, a man? Why? Why do you care? Why do you care about me? Why do you care about anyone? Why do you care? Now, this question is eerily similar, isn't it, to a verse found in Psalm 8, in which the psalm writer says these words at the beginning of that psalm. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babies and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? He asks a question. In the vastness of existence, how in the world could God care about any one of us? Now let me tell you where we're at here, because I know we often think more highly of ourselves than we ought to, right? Okay, so let's put this into perspective. I got on an airplane in New Orleans about a month ago and flew from New Orleans to Boston, Boston to Paris, Paris to Nairobi. It's a distance by air of roughly 10,000 miles. And I went across that 26 hours of time on a device going 550 miles an hour on average. It took me 26 hours to get there. I made it 1/3 of the way around this planet. 1/3 of the way. 1/3. And I had to fly it back too. Okay? And it reminds me of the fact that I am nothing but a tiny, tiny speck on this planet. Think about how many miles of details and stuff I passed over going 550 miles an hour from New Orleans to Boston to Paris to Nairobi. Think about all that distance and all the people I passed over and all the trees I passed over and all the grains of sand that I passed over as we flew over the Sahara and so on. I am nothing but a tiny, minuscule little speck on this planet. And then let's expand our perspective, right? As I look at the heavens, okay, there's a picture, a beautiful picture. If you want to Google it someday, I suggest you do so. They took a picture from one of the Voyager spacecraft as it was coming under the rings of Saturn back towards the Earth and took a picture of the Earth from there. Little tiny blue dot hanging in space. Here you see the rings of Saturn, nice and big, right? It's right above the Voyagers is passing by, and you see this tiny little speck, this little blue speck. And that's not even outside this solar system. That's only halfway across this solar system, in fact, where that picture was taken. A tiny little blue dot. I am but a tiny little speck on a tiny little blue dot hanging in this infinite, quote unquote, space all around us. And you're probably all saying to yourself, man, this pastor's gone fatalistic this morning, hasn't he? But that's Job's point, and that's exactly the point of the psalm writer. If we really stop and get our perspective straight about who we really are, we are a gnat on a flea on the back of a dog. We are tiny little creatures in the midst of nowhere. And yet, God knows us. And yet God knows us. The question might be rhetorical. In other words, there's no answer to the question given, but the obvious answer is because he created us. And he set his heart on us because he set his mind on us. In Psalm 8, the writer asked the question in the framework of the glory of God, that God has crowned humanity with a glory from himself, and this is the praise of his name. Here, Job asked this question in the framework of the brevity of human life. How is it that God could care at all about the puny creatures inhabiting this puny planet? Especially given their short duration and plight on the earth as compared to his infinite nature. Right? If we're lucky, we get 70, 80, if you're really fortunate. 50 if you're, one of those unbelievable kind of persons. And how many scores has God got? We live a tiny little time on this earth and we disappear. In the midst of a world covered by the curse, how can an infinite God have anything to do with us, his finite creatures? How can he love us, sinners that we are? And the answer to the question that Job gives is he implies through this mystery that the only way to make it through this life, the only way to survive before God is by this infinite one providing the support we need to carry on. See it? It's what Calvin said earlier, right? We are weak, pitiful, puny, tiny creatures living in a sin-filled, cursed world. And yet, God holds on to his own. Now, here's what's fascinating about this. As I said earlier, Job does not know about the heavenly council and what took place. He does not know. that God made a declaration over him. And yet in his heart he knows that to be true. These rhetorical questions are not just designed to say, life is worthless and puny. No, he is replying to Eliphaz. Remember? He is saying something to his friend, and he's saying something to God. He's saying, I might be puny and tiny and filled with trouble, and life may be short, but in the end, you, oh God, care about that. You care about that. If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Think about that for a second. Does our sin really affect God? Does it? Does it change God? Does it make him somehow different when we sin? Is God affected by our sin? Does his holiness change one iota because we choose to sin? And the answer, of course, is no. And yet, isn't the implication of the question that you do care when I sin? It does affect you. Not in the sense that it changes you, but in the sense that you are concerned about it. You see the point he's making? By asking these kinds of rhetorical questions, he is dealing with this in the only way a man in his place could. He does not know fully the nature of God, right? He lives before the full revelation of God shows up to us. But we know the full nature of God in relation to puny humans, right? We know. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way in chapter 2. For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. See what the writer is saying? He's saying we know. We know what it means for God to be concerned about us, because God became one of us. The infinite God of the universe took on a physical flesh like yours, entered as a puny creature on this tiny little speck floating in this gigantic universe, but he did. And did that to accomplish the purposes of God. You see, our human strength against trials and temptations is utterly insufficient. We need for God to sustain us and to preserve us. And this is why we go to him in faith. We don't go to him with religion. We go to him with an empty hand of faith, because we don't possess anything. We don't possess anything that's capable of keeping us in relationship to this God. The only one who can is the one who became like us. This is a massive and interesting paradox, isn't it? That God would become a puny, tiny, insignificant little creature on a planet like this, but it would become the very essence of God's purpose over a puny little world full of people that he loves. Now remember, Job knows none of that. We do. So that leads to a natural question. My wife asked me this question last week as we were going home, and it's a perfectly legitimate question. I would confess, I didn't think of it when I was doing my introduction, but here it is. Why is this book in our Bible? I mean, really. Because in many ways, this book seems to contradict the very essence of the gospel. It's like men floundering around in the dark. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to talk about these things. They know these truths, but they're just unsure, right? Flying around in the dark. Why is this Bible? Why would God put this here in our scriptures? And I think the answer is to show us the default thinking of men. Before anything of redemptive history begins, if we start counting redemptive history at Abraham, right? Okay, so here we are. Now, I realize all of Genesis is part of redemptive history as well, but the actual beginning of God working out his decree to save a people really starts with God calling Abraham to establish a nation and so forth. So here we have a man living before that. What does he know? What does he have? Zippity-doo-dah. He's got nothing. But God puts this book in our Bible to say, listen, those of you who have the fullness of the revelation, read this book through that lens. This is how men think. If no revelation had ever been given, this is how the world would think. Men wander around going, I know there's a creator, but I have no idea how I relate to him. I have no idea how it is possible for me to be loved. I know that he does, I just don't know how or why. But we do. We have no excuse. We have books like Hebrews in our Bibles. It tells us precisely what it is that the psalm writer was saying is, who is man that you are mindful of him? Job is trying to answer the question of his friends, trying to answer the objection of his friends by pointing out to his friends, listen, your advice misses the mark. You know, you think you know what's going on? Guess what? You don't. You don't have a clue. You've just tried to narrow it down to one simplistic little thing. God is a God that must be appeased. So go appease him and everything will be okay. And Job says, that doesn't explain it. That's not big enough. That doesn't deal with the realities of what was going on. So we fast forward 4,000 years, and here we read this book, we go, we know the answer. We know the answer, and the answer is Jesus Christ. We know the answer is a God who sent his only begotten Son into the world to experience all of what we experience so that we could look at him and go, he's the answer. He's the answer. It's unfortunate that Job didn't know that, but I think he does now. So keep that in mind as you're working through this book, as you think about these replies, as Job is trying to make his good points. He does it, as I said, rather badly, but he attempts to defend the larger picture that his friends seem to want to simplify too far. And that's fundamentally what we see.